In 1970, a classified Soviet proposal to connect every factory, warehouse, and planning office in the largest country on Earth into a single real-time computer network was quietly killed, not by technological failure, not by lack of funding, but by the very bureaucrats it was designed to replace. The man behind the idea was Viktor Glushkov, a mathematician and cyberneticist working out of Kiev, and the system he envisioned, called OGAS, bore an uncanny resemblance to something the United States would not fully realize for another 2 decades. So why has almost no one in the West ever heard of OGAS, and how close did the Soviet Union actually come to building its own version of the Internet before America did? To understand how this story begins, you have to go back to 1948, the year the Soviet Union officially declared cybernetics a bourgeois pseudoscience. The term itself, coined by the American mathematician Norbert Wiener, referred to the study of systems, feedback loops, and communication, whether in machines, organisms, or societies. In Stalin's Soviet Union, this was dangerous territory. The idea that human behavior and economic planning could be modeled by machines smelled of Western reductionism, of stripping the Soviet worker down to a data point. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia, the regime's official reference work, denounced cybernetics as a reactionary tool of imperialism. Researchers who showed interest in the field risked their careers. Some risked more than that. In the late Stalinist period, intellectual deviation was not an abstract threat. People disappeared for less. And so, for nearly a decade, the Soviet Union suppressed the very discipline that would later become the foundation of the digital age. Then Stalin died, March 5, 1953, and slowly, unevenly, the intellectual climate began to thaw. By the mid-1950s, Soviet mathematicians and engineers started cautiously rehabilitating cybernetics. A pivotal 1955 article in the journal Voprazy Philosophiae argued that cybernetics was not ideologically incompatible with Marxism-Leninism, but could, in fact, serve it. The logic was seductive. If cybernetics was about managing complex systems through information and feedback, then what was the Soviet planned economy if not the most complex system in the world? If machines could help optimize it, then cybernetics was not the enemy. It was the answer. By 1959, the Soviet Academy of Sciences had established a formal council on cybernetics. The ban was over, and the race to apply computing to the Soviet economy had begun. But this race was not happening in a vacuum. Across the Atlantic, the United States military was already building something. If you are watching this and you have ever wondered how much of the technology we take for granted today was shaped not by Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, but by Cold War paranoia and centralized state planning, then this channel is built for you. Consider subscribing. We dig into the real mechanics of Soviet and Cold War history, the kind that rarely makes it into textbooks but reshapes how you understand the modern world. Now, back to the story. In the late 1950s, the US Department of Defense was wrestling with a terrifying problem. In the event of a Soviet nuclear first strike, how would military commanders communicate if phone lines were destroyed, if relay stations were vaporized, if the chain of command was physically severed? The answer, developed over the next decade through ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, was a decentralized communication network. A system where information could route itself around damage, hopping from node to node without relying on any single central hub. By 1969, ARPANET, the direct ancestor of the modern Internet, connected 4 university computers across the western United States. The first message, sent from UCLA to Stanford on October 29, 1969, was supposed to be the word login. The system crashed after 2 letters. They sent low. It was not an auspicious start, but it worked, and it would grow. Here is the part that most people do not know. While ARPANET was being conceived in American defense laboratories, a parallel vision was taking shape 3,000 miles to the east in a very different political system, for very different reasons, but with strikingly similar architecture. The man at the center of it was Viktor Mikhailovich Glushkov. Glushkov was born in 1923 in Rostov-on-Don. He trained as a mathematician, earned his doctorate, and by the late 1950s, had become one of the most prominent figures in Soviet computing. In 1962, he was appointed director of the Institute of Cybernetics in Kiev, which under his leadership became the most important computer science institution in the entire Soviet Union. Glushkov was not a dissident. He was not a renegade. He was a true believer, a loyal Soviet scientist who genuinely thought that the planned economy could work if only it had the right tools. And the tool he envisioned was unprecedented in scope. The Soviet economy in the early 1960s was drowning in its own complexity. Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, was responsible for setting production targets, prices, and distribution schedules for every product in the country, every bolt, every tire, every loaf of bread. By some estimates, the Soviet economy required the coordination of over 20 million distinct products. The planning process generated mountains of paperwork. Literally mountains. Reports flowed upward from factories to ministries. Targets flowed downward from ministries to factories. And in between, at every level, human beings made decisions based on incomplete, outdated, and often deliberately falsified information. Factory managers routinely inflated their output numbers to meet quotas. Regional officials massaged statistics to please their superiors. By the time data reached Moscow, it bore only a passing resemblance to reality. The Soviet economy was not just inefficient, it was flying blind. Glushkov saw this clearly, and his proposed solution was breathtaking in its ambition. He called it OGAS, an acronym that translates roughly to the All-State Automated System for Gathering and Processing Information for Accounting, Planning, and Management of the National Economy. The name was a bureaucratic mouthful. The idea behind it was revolutionary. OGAS would consist of a hierarchical network of computer centers spanning the entire Soviet Union. At the top, a central computing facility in Moscow. Below it, roughly 200 mid-level centers in major cities and industrial regions. Below those, approximately 20,000 local terminals in factories, warehouses, and enterprises. All connected, all sharing data in real time. The network would collect economic information from the ground level, process it through mathematical models, and feed optimized planning decisions back down the chain. It was, in essence, an internet, not for communication between individuals, but for the automated management of an entire national economy. Glushkov envisioned it replacing not just paper-based planning, but eventually money itself. He imagined a system of electronic payments, digital accounts, a cashless economy managed by algorithms. In 1962, let that sink in for a moment. A Soviet cyberneticist working in a country that had banned his field less than 15 years earlier proposed a nationwide computer network with real-time data sharing, automated optimization, and electronic financial transactions more than half a decade before the first ARPANET message was sent. The question is not whether Glushkov was brilliant. He clearly was. The question is why his vision was never built. The answer is not technical. The Soviet Union had the engineering talent. It had the mathematical tradition. Glushkov himself had designed several pioneering computers, including the Mir series, one of the first personal computers in the world, which won a prize at a 1967 international exhibition in London. Soviet computer science was not as far behind the West as is sometimes assumed, at least not yet, not in the early 1960s. The gap would widen dramatically in the 1970s and 1980s, but at the moment Glushkov made his proposal, the technological foundation was plausible. The obstacles were human. To understand why, you need to understand the structure of Soviet bureaucratic power. The planned economy was not just an economic system, it was a power system. Every ministry, every regional planning office, every Gosplan department controlled a slice of the information flow. And information, in a system without market prices, was the most valuable currency of all. The minister who controlled the data on steel production had leverage over the minister who needed steel. The regional party boss who could selectively report good numbers to Moscow maintained his position. The factory director who kept two sets of books, one real and one for the inspectors, survived. OGAS threatened all of this. A transparent, real-time data network would strip away the informational advantages that bureaucrats had spent decades accumulating. It would make lying harder. It would make accountability automatic. And the people who stood to lose the most were precisely the people who had the power to approve or reject the project. Glushkov formally presented the OGAS proposal to the Soviet leadership in the early 1960s. It reached the desk of Alexei Kosygin, who became chairman of the Council of Ministers in 1964 after Khrushchev's ouster. Kosygin was a pragmatist, interested in economic reform and initially receptive. But OGAS also needed the support of the Central Committee, the Politburo, and crucially, the heads of the economic ministries. And here the resistance was fierce. The most significant opposition came from the Ministry of Finance and from Gosplan itself. Vasily Garbuzov, the Minister of Finance from 1960 to 1985, was particularly hostile. Sources differ on his exact motivations, but the pattern is clear. Garbuzov saw OGAS as a direct threat to his ministry's control over financial information. A unified digital system would centralize data in ways that made the Ministry of Finance's traditional gatekeeping role obsolete. He was not alone. Across the Soviet bureaucracy, middle-level officials recognized that OGAS would expose the inefficiencies, the falsified reports, the hidden reserves that they depended on to navigate the system. They did not frame their opposition in those terms, of course. They spoke the language of caution. The project was too expensive. The technology was unproven. The timeline was unrealistic. The cost estimates, they argued, were astronomical, upward of 20 billion rubles, a figure that made even sympathetic officials hesitate. Here is a pattern interrupt that is worth pausing on. 20 billion rubles in the 1960s was an enormous sum. But consider what the Soviet Union was spending on its military and space programs during the same period. The Soviet nuclear weapons program consumed resources on a comparable scale. The space program, which put Yuri Gagarin in orbit in 1961 and continued with massive expenditures throughout the decade, was not cheap either. The money was there. What was missing was the political will, because the beneficiaries of OGAS were abstract, the entire economy, the entire country, while the losers were specific, powerful, and sitting in the rooms where decisions were made. By the late 1960s, the OGAS proposal had been diluted almost beyond recognition. Instead of a single unified national network, the Soviet leadership approved a fragmented approach. Individual ministries and enterprises would develop their own automated management systems, known as ASU, independently. There would be no central network, no interoperability, no unified data standard. Each ministry would build its own little digital fiefdom, perfectly replicating in silicon the same bureaucratic silos that existed in paper. Glushkov was devastated but did not give up. He continued to push for OGAS throughout the 1970s, publishing papers, lobbying officials, refining his models. But the window had closed. The political moment had passed. And with each year, the fragmented ASU systems became more entrenched, more incompatible, and more useless for the kind of integrated planning Glushkov had envisioned. Meanwhile, in the United States, ARPANET was growing. By 1971, it connected 23 host computers. By the mid-1970s, the network had expanded to include dozens of universities and research institutions. The technology was evolving rapidly. TCP/IP, the protocol that would become the backbone of the modern Internet, was developed by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn in 1974. And here is the irony that makes this story so bitter for those who study it. ARPANET succeeded in part because it was decentralized, because no single institution controlled it, because it was designed to route around obstacles, whether those obstacles were nuclear explosions or bureaucratic interference. OGAS failed in part because the Soviet system could not tolerate the very thing that made a network powerful, the free flow of information. There is another layer to this story that deserves attention. Glushkov was not the only Soviet thinker working on these ideas. In the late 1950s, a far more radical proposal had come from Anatoly Kitov, a military computing pioneer. Kitov proposed using the Soviet military's existing computer infrastructure, which was more advanced than the civilian sector, to manage the civilian economy during off-peak hours. His idea was elegant and practical. The military computers sat idle at night, so why not use them to run economic planning calculations? Kitov submitted his proposal, known as the Red Book Project, to the Central Committee in 1959. The military establishment was furious. The idea that civilian planners would have access to military hardware, even in limited time windows, was treated as a security threat. Kitov was expelled from the Communist Party and removed from his position. His career was effectively destroyed. By the time Glushkov came along with OGAS a few years later, the precedent had been set. Proposing to network the Soviet Union's computers was career suicide, and yet Glushkov persisted. This is what makes him such a compelling figure. He understood the resistance. He knew the bureaucratic landscape. He tried to navigate it. He made concessions, redesigned the system, reduced the scope, courted allies. He was not naive. He was strategic. But he was asking the Soviet system to do something it was structurally incapable of doing, to voluntarily surrender informational control in exchange for systemic efficiency. The system chose itself. Let us consider a striking comparison. In the United States, The development of ARPANET and later the Internet was driven initially by military concerns but quickly expanded into the academic and eventually the commercial sphere. The key insight was that the network's value grew exponentially with each new node, each new user, each new connection. This is Metcalfe's law, though it would not be formally articulated until later. The American system, with its decentralized funding structures, its university research culture, and its tolerance for bottom-up innovation, was accidentally well suited to nurturing a network. The Soviet system, with its top-down planning, its ministerial fiefdoms, and its deep suspicion of uncontrolled information flow, was almost perfectly designed to prevent one. Glushkov died on January 30, 1982, at the age of 58. Some accounts suggest that the stress of decades of bureaucratic warfare had taken a severe toll on his health. He did not live to see the Soviet Union's collapse, which came 9 years later in 1991, a collapse driven in no small part by exactly the kind of economic dysfunction he had spent his career trying to solve. The planned economy, unable to process the complexity of a modern industrial state, unable to correct its own errors because the information it relied on was systematically corrupted, ground to a halt. The irony is almost unbearable. The system that killed OGAS was ultimately killed by the very problems OGAS was designed to fix. There is a declassified detail worth mentioning here. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union, having failed to build its own computer networking infrastructure, increasingly turned to copying Western technology. The policy of reverse engineering IBM mainframes and later personal computers became official, though never publicly acknowledged. Soviet clones of the IBM System 360, known as the ES-EVM series, became the standard for Soviet computing. This decision, driven partly by the failure to develop an indigenous alternative like OGAS, locked the Soviet Union into permanent technological dependence on Western designs. Every time IBM released an update, Soviet engineers had to wait, obtain the hardware through espionage or trade, and painstakingly copy it. The gap widened. By the mid-1980s, when Mikhail Gorbachev launched his reform programs, the Soviet Union had roughly 150,000 computers. The United States had tens of millions. The digital divide was not just a gap, it was a chasm. But what if OGAS had been built? This is the counterfactual question that historians and computer scientists have debated for decades. Some argue that even a fully implemented OGAS could not have saved the Soviet planned economy, because the fundamental problem was not data processing but incentives. No computer network, however sophisticated, could solve the problem of factory managers who had every reason to lie about their output. Others argue that OGAS, by making information transparent and accessible, could have shifted the incentive structure itself, making it harder to falsify data and easier to identify bottlenecks. The truth, as with most counterfactuals, is unknowable. What we do know is that the technical vision was sound, the timing was plausible, and the failure was political. Benjamin Peters, an American scholar who wrote the most comprehensive English-language account of the OGAS story in his 2016 book, summed up the paradox with remarkable precision. He observed that the first global computer network was built by capitalists who cooperated with each other, while the Soviet network was prevented by socialists who competed with each other. The Americans, operating in a system supposedly driven by competition, collaborated across institutions to build ARPANET. The Soviets, operating in a system supposedly driven by collective planning, could not stop their own bureaucrats from sabotaging a collective project. The labels did not match the behavior. The market economy produced cooperation. The planned economy produced competition, not competition for consumers or innovation, but competition for bureaucratic turf, for informational advantage, for political survival. This inversion is one of the most revealing insights of the entire Cold War. It suggests that the failure of Soviet computing was not primarily a failure of engineering or ideology in the abstract, but a failure of institutional design. The Soviet system created incentives that were rational for individuals, but catastrophic for the collective, precisely the kind of coordination problem that cybernetics was supposed to solve. The system could not reform itself because the people who would need to implement the reform were the same people who benefited from the status quo. It was a trap, elegant in its cruelty. There is one more thread worth pulling. After the Soviet Union collapsed, many of the scientists and engineers who had worked on Soviet computing projects emigrated or found work in the private sector. Some ended up in Silicon Valley, some ended up in the Russian and Ukrainian tech industries that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. The intellectual legacy of Soviet cybernetics did not vanish. It dispersed. The ideas that Glushkov and his colleagues developed about network architecture, about automated planning, about the relationship between information and economic efficiency resurfaced in different forms. Today, when we talk about algorithmic management, about big data, about the use of artificial intelligence to optimize supply chains, we are walking on ground that Glushkov mapped 60 years ago. The tools have changed. The fundamental questions have not. Can a complex economy be managed by algorithms? What happens when transparency conflicts with power? Who controls the data, and what does that control mean? Viktor Glushkov imagined a world where information flowed freely through a vast network, where decisions were made on the basis of real data rather than political convenience, where the machinery of the state served its citizens rather than its administrators. He imagined this world in a country that could not tolerate it. The network he designed was not destroyed by a rival power or by technological limitation. It was smothered in its crib by the very system it was meant to save. And across the ocean, in a country that theoretically celebrated individual competition over collective planning, a group of researchers quietly built the thing that the Soviets could not. Not because they were smarter, not because they had better computers, but because their system, for all its flaws, allowed information to flow in ways that the Soviet system could not permit. The internet was not invented by ideology, it was invented by the absence of a bureaucrat powerful enough to stop it. And that perhaps is the most Soviet lesson of all.